Hi, I'm Danila, PhD candidate at the Bucharest National University of Arts, currently investigating the photographs that Romanian migrants generated while working abroad. My main research interests include the politics and ethics of representation, vernacular archival and photographic practices, and the relationship between image and memory. But today I'm gonna talk about a very specific topic, wars on children, the visual representations of child refugees from Syria and Ukraine. But first, let me introduce you the context of this paper. As we all know, on February 24th, the war in Ukraine broke out, forcing 6 million people to seek refuge in other European countries. The violence of this conflict and the massive wave of refugees that it generated calls to mind another conflict from another time, the Syrian civil war that started in 2011 and continues to this day. And also the humanitarian crisis of 2015, when asylum seekers started for the first time to reach European countries in high numbers. These conflicts have a lot in common, but I'm interested in one specific thing. Both of them have had massive media coverage from media outlets, but also from individuals on social media, meaning that people across the world were constantly receiving live information from the battlefield directly on their social feeds. So in a way, we can say that these wars were kind of reality show wars. What I'm interested in particular in these two conflicts is the regimes of representation that the images generated during the conflicts generated in regards to child refugees. Another aim for me is to investigate the various images of otherness that photojournalists and media outlets produced in this war. But also, more importantly, my aim is to move the focus of research on less favored aspects of photographic representation. So instead of adding to the numerous analyses regarding the depiction of suffering faces and bodies in times of war, this paper pays attention to the material realities surrounding the human victims portrayed in photographs of war. Why I'm proposing this new focus? Firstly, because despite their apparent insignificance, material details that surround the subjects of a photograph have the capacity to provide valuable information regarding the assumptions of the photographers, the places in the world that the photographers assign to these subjects, and their relation to the subjects and the spaces they depict. Also, material details are generally considered less important than human subjects, and they open the possibility for visual accidents, for unintended revelations. Specifically, I'm referring to the optical unconscious that Walter Benjamin was referring to a couple of decades ago. These optical unconscious, these accidents, have the ability to show aspects of reality that the photographer himself did not intend to capture and to show to the world. As research methods, I focused on a comparative content analysis, visual content analysis of two sets of photographs, photographs portraying child refugees from Syria and photographs portraying child refugees from Ukraine, both of which are currently available on a prominent Romanian news agency. For the Ukrainian crisis, I've chosen all the photographs that were shown as search results for the keyword Copil Ucraina, Ukraine child, whereas for the Syrian crisis, I've included all the photographs from 2015 that corresponded to the keyword Copil Syria, Syria child. I've chosen these two keywords because they are the most obvious choices for people who want to search for photographs depicting refugees. Although not exhaustive, this analysis, this qualitative analysis, sheds some light on the visual tropes that media discourses employ when referring to people with different national, ethnic, or religious identities, as is the case of these two words. So before jumping to the results of the analysis, let me take a moment to introduce a very important concept, the concept of ekphrasis, the Greek word for the practice of ancient Greek philosophers of creating written descriptions that evoked visual entities, visual objects. So because this paper focuses on a very vulnerable social group, children in a vulnerable, tragic position, war, the images I'm referring to in this paper will not be shown. Instead, they will be replaced by something called image texts. Image texts are written images, in fact, written descriptions of images that make use of this long-standing tradition of ekphrasis. So we've reached the analysis findings. And first of all, I'm going to show an overall picture of the findings in order for you to understand what categories of photographs the photojournalist produced. So for Syria child search, I've identified 44 photos from 2015. All of them were captured in Hungary during a very specific event, the arrival of refugees to Hungary. Most of them were taken in a train station, while some of them were also depicting child migrants in transit. Overall, all these images were characterized by impoverished contexts, by a lack of material objects that could supply comfortable conditions. Usually, children and adults were portrayed crowded in some spaces or in disarray in large numbers. In one case, the police was also present. In the case of the Ukrainian child search, I've identified 84 photos from this year, most of them captured in Romania. In this case, the content of the pictures is much more diverse. Some of the pictures are depicting, are showing people engaged in creative activities. Others are showing children in official camps and tents, as opposed to the Syrian case where children are often portrayed in improvised camps. But most of the pictures also portray migrants in transit in the Ukrainian case. However, the big difference as opposed to the Syrian case is that Ukrainian children are surrounded by much more positive contexts: toys, luggage, adults, supporting volunteers or authorities. But In order for me to gain a much deeper impression of the differences between these two classes of photographs, I've decided to take the specific case of two very similar images from the two crises and transform them into image texts. The first image I'm referring to is portraying a Syrian children on a train in Ukraine. In this case, the photographer is outside looking in. Framed by a dirty window frame, we have 4 adults and one child that are shown looking away, not confronting the photographer. And with the exception of one man in the background, all the other subjects seem lost in thoughts. Furthermore, upon closer inspection, one realizes that 2 other child silhouettes can be distinguished behind the glass, but their faces are obscured by the reflection of a police car. The child in the foreground, a girl, holds a pack of wafers in one hand, while the other hand is pressed against the window. In fact, all the children are pressing their palms against the windows in a gesture that somehow reiterates other well-known images of exile from our common culture. The overall feeling that the image conveys is of a cramped space with only a woman and a child seated. And the sensation is reinforced by the posture of a man on the left of the picture that has half of his body sticking out of a very small opening of the window. In the case of the Ukrainian photograph, we have basically another child looking out on the window of another train 7 years later, but in the same place, Hungary. This time, as I've mentioned, the child is of Ukrainian origin. But unlike the first image, this one is captured from inside the train. No other person is visible in the frame. The child is comfortably seated on a chair covered by a colorful pattern. And in the foreground, we even see a small red bag belonging to the child. The child himself is dressed in a blue winter coat, a light blue hat, resting his head against the window frame, a clean window frame, and looking out the window. Although the outside scenery is blocked, we can see the child's neat reflection in the window. So what are these two cases are showing us? First of all, what we're seeing here is that these images create different regimes of representation. And there are some conspicuous differences in the spatial and material context in which Syrian and Ukrainian children are presented in photographs. Specifically, Ukrainian children, as we've already seen, are surrounded by elements with positive connotations among other family members, or in the middle of piles of luggage, in clean buses and trains, or in the safety of a refugee center. They are almost always holding a toy or a gadget, and they are shown in calm postures, sleeping, gazing, smiling, playing, and very rarely crying or looking sad. On the other hand, Syrian child refugees are presented in more dramatic circumstances, in uncomfortable, precarious, and even humiliating situations. Generally, they are shown stuck in a crowded place, in a crowded frame, in the middle of frugal material contexts that are marked by poverty, neglect, or danger. Among the objects that occur frequently in these photographs, one can notice garbage piles, improvised tents, bare spaces, lots of concrete surfaces, blankets on the pavement, and agglomerations of bodies and things. Following all the aspects and the things that I identified in the two sets of photographs, I reached several conclusions. First of all, following Tom Hollert's argument that photographs are performative and they imply some sort of violence, I argue that the pictures depicting child refugees produce several types of violence that vary in degree from one ethnic group to another. First of all, I've identified a form of political violence common to both Syrian and Ukrainian children because their images are used by outsiders as if they have renounced every right on self-representation. In some cases, their particular situations even become symbols of a conflict. But there is also a social violence at play, which affects the two groups to varying degrees. The children's bodies, in both cases, enter the public visual discourse in a context marked by insecurity, fear, and defeat. Thus, new identities and memories are imposed on them, which they must later combat through counter memories as adults. But even in this case, the Syrian children have harsher depictions to combat, as I've shown earlier. Thirdly, both groups are subjected to a subtle epistemic violence in the sense that their voices and experiences are muted by visual representations constructed by outsiders, in this case, the photojournalists. This is even more evident in the case of the Syrian children, where an unconscious, pitiful gaze is present in most of the images. Even though refugees themselves create images, the ones created by photojournalists and media outlets have a far wider reach. Lastly, unlike the Ukrainian counterparts, the Syrian children are also victims of an economic violence, since their photographs always convey a sense of poverty and destitution. Following all the things I've mentioned so far, I think a new challenge and a new opportunity for debate arises. So if we accept the proposal that photographs are performative with the potential to act on the world, this paper findings show that visual depictions of children during wartime have the capacity to further add to prejudices against non-Europeans. As Derrida said, photo archives do not only concern the past, but are also problems of the future. So this means that images meant to document past or present injuries, such in the case of Ukrainian and Syrian wars, these images might replicate those same injustices that they want to avoid in the future, because they normalize situations of suffering through the power of visual representation. So in the end, I'm leaving you with a question, with an open question. Is there a possibility, or what are the means to create new visualities that give voice to people in vulnerable positions without further victimizing them? Thank you.